Welcome back. I'm joined by Adam Zivo as we unpack the latest in the Ukraine-Russia war. And again, thanks, Adam, for joining me today. Just before the commercial break, we were discussing, again, that infamous press conference in the White House with Zelensky on one side and then J.D. Vance. Actually, there were a whole plethora of individuals. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, was there. But things quickly, well, I shouldn't say quickly, towards the end, it really derailed. And I think a lot of folks around the world were sort of taken aback at the tone, the rhetoric. For me, I figured I try to put myself in everyone's shoes, and I thought it must be really hard to be Ukraine in that room. You're a small country, very influential in certain regards, especially in Europe, but you're small, you're beholden to these foreign aid money, and you're always going cap in hand, and yet you have now probably people who have very little knowledge of that part of the world or knowledge of your country kind of dictating what terms you need to expect. It must be really humiliating in some ways, humbling, but also humiliating.
Well, yeah, of course it's humiliating. One could see the tensions between Trump and Zelensky throughout that entire meeting. But for the first 35 minutes of it, Zelensky was very good at keeping his cool. So in the first 35 minutes, they were amiable. They complimented each other. But Zelensky emphasized the suffering of the Ukrainian people. He talked about the fact that 20,000 Ukrainian children were kidnapped at the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion, and they still have not been returned. He talked about the fact that Ukrainian prisoners of war are starved and beaten in Russia. And he emphasized the need for Ukrainians to feel safe. In contrast, Trump tried to draw moral equivalencies between Ukraine and Russia at a point where there was no real moral clarity. There was no indication that, Ukraine was the victim here, that Ukraine had been invaded. At one point, Trump talked about how he felt so sad for the parents of both Ukrainian and Russian soldiers, at which point Zelensky muttered, I think he broke his cool, he muttered, they invaded our country, right? But it's,
But do you think that was posturing to try to get Russia to the table? Because Russia has been very hesitant to talk about any kind of ceasefire and peace, etc.
Well, I think it'd be naive to think that one can get Russia to the table for good faith negotiations. Russia has broken every single ceasefire it's signed with Ukraine in the past, and that was something that Zelensky kept emphasizing throughout that meeting. And towards the very end, he did bring up the fact that, hey, we've tried the diplomatic route. We've been doing the diplomatic route since 2014, and look where it got us. It got to Ukraine being invaded fully, right? And so he said, we need to have security guarantees, because without security guarantees, what will happen to Ukraine if Russia breaks another ceasefire yet again?
Right.
And that's when J.D. Vance freaked out. Now, I don't think that Trump is just trying to get the Russians to the negotiating table. It feels as if he's giving the Russians everything that they want, right? Because Ukraine has been asked to concede all sorts of things, giving up NATO membership,
right,
being limit the size of its military.
Because those are the demands from Russia, right? They said, you got to forget NATO membership, which is strange because that's sort of ominous, saying, well, what are you planning then?
Exactly, right? And then Russia's saying, well, you need to roll back NATO from Eastern Europe. And the question is, why? What do you intend to do in Eastern Europe? We can see that Russian propagandists on state television in Russia constantly talk about the need to reestablish the Russian Empire and to subjugate the Baltics, subjugate Moldova and Poland. And that seems to be what Russia wants, right? And reporters have asked Trump over the past 2 months, what is Russia being asked to concede? And American officials have struggled to answer that question. It
Right.
seems as if Russia is being indulged and the Ukrainians are being asked to make all the sacrifices. And that's a very one-sided negotiation.
Well, it sounds like, I guess they'd be asking to concede full invasion of the country, right? You'll get annex these lands that you've already taken, which I'm not agreeing with, by the way, because just because someone takes something doesn't mean that they should get it. And this is part of the problem when you have these made in the West, I guess, peace agreements, is there's always a loser, and usually it's the smaller, less mightily country. So it's how those things happen, and not how they happen, how they will work for the future, goodness knows. Zelensky repeatedly mentioned that what happens if they break the ceasefire? And as you said, it's sort of expected that Russia will break the ceasefire. What would happen then?
Well, it depends on whether or not there are European peacekeepers, and whether or not that happens will depend on which faction within the Trump administration wins out in these negotiations, because we have to keep in mind that there are two main factions involved. One which is led by Keith Kellogg, who is the special envoy to Ukraine, used to be the special envoy to Ukraine and Russia. And another guy, the other faction is led by a guy named something, I've heard his first name, his last name is Witkoff. And he is another envoy. He's a personal friend of Trump who is quite pro-Russian.
Oh, wow. Okay, we're going to talk more about this issue and unpack more when we return from this commercial break. Please stick around.